You know, when I was 8 and my family decided to move we needed another place to live, was because the family home we were renting on Dunlevy Street was being demolished because the government had acquired it, the city, as part of the urban renewal program for Strathcona. And they wanted to build public housing, which is now known as McLean Park, because it's actually built on the park that was called McLean Park. And then they relocated the park to here, this neighborhood, which is at from Heatley to Hawks, because it was more central to the neighborhood. And so the McLean Park was relocated here, but also at great cost, because they demolished all the homes that used to be on this block. So I went to, when I was growing up here, we used to play in the neighborhood, and my mother, when it was time to come for dinner, she would just stand on the porch and shout my name, Shirley! And of course, we wouldn't be too far away. We'd hear her, we'd come home. We knew not to go too far away. But by then, this park was here, and we could go and play on the swings, and they had a wading pool, which of course today you don't have wading pools anymore because a kid might drown in it, right? So anyway, we had a wading pool, and we used to have a good time in this neighborhood. But the creation of the park, there was a lot of tears because people's homes were demolished. And the expropriation of this whole neighborhood, we learned they were offering $6,000 to $8,000 for a house and land, and my parents had paid $12,000 for ours, and they had invested additional money in it because they thought, when the government's press releases and communications were, that they were going to improve this neighborhood, they were going to make it much better, they were going to tear down the old run-down properties, the blighted properties. And so they thought, oh, well, then we'd better fix this up, because our house was an old house. Even though it was in good shape inside, it needed a fresh paint job or whatever. So they went and put on asbestos shingling, thinking that would keep it fireproof and really be a statement about how proud we were of our home and how well maintained it was. It was hard in those days to really get permits to do very much, because the city had a grand master plan to demolish this whole neighborhood and realign all the streets and put in lots of public housing and 3-story walk-ups. That was mostly the plan for apartment buildings. And renew this neighborhood. The funding for the program, the urban renewal program, was three-way, right? The federal government contributed 50 cents on every dollar, and then the province 25 and the city 25. And so the city was able to buy up property using their powers of expropriation, and then resell the land to a developer at what we would call a subsidized rate, so that they could build what the city had planned, which were the apartment buildings for the neighborhood. We would have, of course, lost what we call today the Victorian heritage houses, which Strathcona has managed to save quite a few of. And if you go through the neighborhood, you will see that today they're not mostly occupied by Chinese, Italians, or German Canadians anymore. There are young families living in them, and they've really restored the Victorian homes. And they're quite beautiful houses today. The streetscapes are quite broken up because the city would buy any houses that they could and then demolish what was there when the opportunity came up. That was easier than having to go and expropriate someone. When we started, my mother worked through 3 phases of urban renewal. The first phase, I was quite young, I guess I was about 10. She dragged me through the neighborhood with a bag that had a petition on it asking people to sign, and maybe asking for any contributions of funds that would help us hire a lawyer to speak for the neighborhood, to go to City Hall, to write a brief to present to council. And so the first, she'd get yelled at, and I would be dragged along because I was supposed to interpret for her. But her English was good enough that she made herself understood. She'd been working in garment factories by then, for a long time by then. And so she could make herself understood. And I used to complain that, why are you dragging me around when you can do all the talking anyway? And she'd say, well, it's important for me to be able to communicate myself. She would do that when she went job hunting too. She'd drag me along and I'd have to interpret, but she did all the talking. So, but I provided a little backup, right, for her. So anyway, we would go door to door. Sometimes she would be accused of trying to get rich on the money collected. People would sometimes not open the doors, and other times they slammed the door in our faces when she explained why she was calling. But that didn't discourage her. She would come home from work, go out and knock on doors, or on the weekend, if she had some extra time, she would do that. And so twice lawyers were hired, twice briefs were prepared for council, and they went forward on behalf of the neighborhood. But people weren't united until they understood that everybody's house was coming down, not just a few select homes on a couple of blocks. And I guess Bessie Lee, who's one of our neighbors, who lived on the 800 block, East Pender, she said, well, it was like Custer's last stand. We knew that this was it. If we didn't stop the city's plans, we were all going to lose our homes. This is where our life savings were. This is where our community was. This is where our hearth is, right? So that's how we managed to bring people together. But we were not just a property owner organization. We knew we wanted to ensure that people who were renters were also looked after. So we became the Strathcona Property Owners and Tenants Association, and that was formed on a cold winter's night at the Gibbs Boys Club, which was the city's first synagogue, right? So that's where we held our meeting. It was an overflow meeting, and nobody really wanted to take on the leadership, so we elected 3 co-chairs. Sue Lum, who was a woman who spoke good English, and she was the one that had always come to knock on our door and tell my mom, this is what the city's planning to do. And so she was a soft-spoken woman, and she owned quite a lot of real estate in the neighborhood. Harry Kahn, who was a businessman who had a store in Chinatown and a post office, which meant he was well connected. And he was elected, and we knew he had political connections, so he was elected as one of the co-chairs. And my father, because he could write very well in Chinese, and he had been up till then working with my mom to help organize the neighborhood, and he had written a lot of newspaper articles for the Chinese papers, calling on the community to unite, to work together, to come forward, to speak out. So he did the organizing through the media. And so the 3 of them were elected the co-chairs. And then I became the English Public Relations officer, because I'd already been to City Hall and so on, because I attended a meeting at First United Church meeting room where Darlene Marzari, who was a social planner at City Hall, and Morris Egan, who was her boss, were there to explain to us about how we would all have to sell our homes to the city and leave the neighborhood, and so her job was to help us relocate. And she found herself instead helping us organize. So it was great. Good for us. She brought in resources like Margaret Mitchell, who was with the Neighborhood Services Association, I think it was. And so United Way, we went and petitioned City Hall. We wrote our briefs, you know, instead of being a 10-year-old dragging around behind her mom, by then I was a university student at Simon Fraser, and there were other young people of my age group, all of whom were either attending university or working. And so we were, having grown up here, we could speak English and represent the families. And we could write English and write our own petitions. We didn't need to hire lawyers this time around. We did it ourselves. And we were able to mobilize people like Bessie to phone council members and say to them, we want you to come to this meeting. We were quite demanding. We began to become, instead of being the soft-spoken Chinese, we were quite aggressive about asking them to come and talk to us and explain to us what they were doing to our neighborhood. And we managed to reach people like Marion Linnell, who was on council. There weren't too many women on council at that time. But we were able to make our feelings and our dissatisfaction and our known. And we were able to lobby the senior levels of government. It was largely the federal government that came to our aid. Through Ron Basford, who was the minister, who was a minister, but he was also the MP for Vancouver Centre. He was able to bring in Paul Hellyer, who was the Minister of Transport responsible for housing. And it was under Paul Hellyer that the program was frozen after he'd had a banquet and a meeting with the people in this neighborhood. He'd also toured the area. The city planners had arranged for him to tour the neighborhood, and I was very lucky. I was invited to sit with him on the bus tour. He invited me aboard. So that helped. The planners were not too pleased about that, but that certainly helped our cause, right? As I was able to point out to him, you know, if you look at this home, the house is true. Maybe the porch sags a bit, but you know, they haven't been able to get permission to do any major renovations or repairs. So, and I was moved personally by listening to my neighbors' stories at that meeting at First United Church with Darlene Marzari and Maurice Egan, where they said, you know, our life savings are here. We live here. Our children and our grandchildren live here. This is our home. This is our nest. This is, you know, and they would say this in Chinese, and someone would have to translate, and but it was very moving to hear that. So we were successful in persuading Paul Hellyer to hear our plight. He didn't know quite what to do, so his first thing was to declare a moratorium on urban renewal. That, well, they had a chance to look at it. Unfortunately for us, he resigned soon thereafter because he was in conflict with Trudeau over something. I guess maybe the PM did not respond quickly enough to that. So we were quite nervous when he resigned. And then I guess Trudeau decided to create a new Ministry of Urban Affairs, Department of Urban Affairs in Ottawa. It didn't have a huge budget, but it had a large responsibility and recognition that more and more people are living in urban centers, and that the urban matters were matters that the federal government needed to address. So it wasn't just through, he was responsible for CMHC, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, but also for other transportation or infrastructure and other issues, right? So he became the Minister of Urban Affairs, and it was Robert Andras who came and met with us in '69, that he said, I recognize that housing is more than bricks and mortar. And then he said to the city, we're not approving any program that does not have the people who are most directly affected support. so they need to support your program. So that's how, as a community, we were invited to join a committee of 3 levels of government and ourselves. So we called ourselves the 4th level of government, to sit down and negotiate an agreement about how to proceed in this neighborhood in urban renewal. Now, part of this whole urban renewal was our realization that the whole east-west, north-south freeway system was part of the picture. And so while we were working to save this neighborhood of 20 city blocks, we realized then that the new Georgia Viaduct that was being built, the one that replaced the little bridge that I used to walk over and toss pebbles into the water below, this was a freeway link. And it was a very large and important key link in the east-west freeway system. We also realized that there was going to be a huge freeway network down in Chinatown, where the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Garden and the Chinese Cultural Center sit today. And that was going to be the north-south, east-west freeway connector. So while this was a link on the east-west freeway, it would go from downtown, fly over Falls Creek, and then plow through Strathcona and Grandview Woodlands all the way out to connect with Highway 1, right? So that was the plan, and we would lose all the homes in between. So then we began to look beyond our own boundaries in our 20 city blocks to the West Enders, because any freeway system would have to go through there. The waterfront freeway, which would have cut off and destroyed any possibility of Cole Harbor being what it is today, but it would have probably served the port very well. It would have done what has happened in most North American cities, that is, divided the community from its waterfront. So we then were able to engage Chinatown in even more support for our fight against urban renewal. And we were able to engage the people from Grandview Woodland. In fact, we had Ann Chan join our board and our executive, and she lived in the 1100 block Union, which is in Grandview, not in our little Strathcona neighborhood. So we were able to then begin to connect the dots, I guess, or connect the neighborhoods against the larger freeway fight. And so we had team at City Hall were just beginning to make inroads. Yeah, I think they'd elected first Art Phillips and Walter Hardwick to council. And they were very responsive. And then we saw that Brian Calder, who was NPA, began to sympathize with a lot of what they were doing. And Marion Linnell we could always get through to, because she didn't really believe that if you hung flower baskets off a freeway, an elevated freeway, that it would really improve things, right, for the neighborhood below. So that's sort of, and we saw that the Georgia Viaduct had destroyed the Hogan's Alley and the black neighborhood and in this area. And we began to see how the warehouses started to disappear, the fruit and vegetable and produce warehouses. So anyway, that was how our little fight began to connect with the bigger fight. And then we saw these incredibly brilliant people from UBC and SFU and students and faculty and so on got involved, and they were probably leading from their end because they were fighting the freeway from their end, but our fight got connected to their fight, and so we had a much broader anti-freeway fight that we were able to join. So that really had an impact on public policy. Again, the federal government was expected to contribute a large amount of the infrastructure spending that the city planned to do, and with that, our little community, by saying, getting Robert Andras, the Minister of Urban Affairs, to say, I'm not supporting any program that doesn't have community support, that really helped to put a stop to both urban renewal and the freeway.
Fantastic.
How's that?
Fantastic.
Okay.
Really good.
Oh, gotta
Wow.
stop. Too much talking.
That was great. 20 minutes. Oh, man. Thank you so much.